There is a question we rarely dare to ask ourselves, but once it appears, nothing remains the same. Is this life truly yours? Or are you simply living inside a sequence of roles that were handed to you? Doing what is right, living what is right, succeeding in the right way. While somewhere deep inside, you still feel empty, exhausted, and lost without knowing why. Carl Jung once said, "Life doesn't really begin until you find yourself. But finding yourself is not about adding more. It is about daring to face what has been left behind. The desires that were once suppressed, the parts of you that you were never allowed to become, and even the shadows you learned to hide in order to be accepted." This video does not promise hollow motivation. It does not teach you to become more positive, stronger, or more successful. It promises something deeper, to help you realize why you have never truly lived fully, even though you have tried so hard. If you have ever felt like you are living someone else's life, if you have ever asked yourself, "Who am I when I no longer have to please anyone?" then perhaps your life has not truly begun yet. And this is where it can begin. 1. The quiet question. Is this life truly yours? There are questions that do not arrive like thunder. They do not shatter our lives in a dramatic instant. They come very softly, almost harmless. Yet once they appear, they quietly rearrange the entire inner order. Is this life truly mine? Not in despair, not when everything collapses, but often on a very ordinary evening, when you have fulfilled every role that was given to you. Work, love, responsibility, correctness. And then, in a very small pause, a strange feeling appears. The feeling that you are living, but not truly there. Carl Jung understood this moment deeply. He did not see it as a crisis, but as the first sign of awakening. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because the moment you begin to doubt the role you are living, you also begin to touch a deeper fear. If this is not me, then who am I?" What is striking is this. At this stage, people do not yet resist. We do not rebel. We do not change suddenly. We do not abandon our current lives. We still fulfill every duty. But inside, a small crack has formed between what we are and something more authentic that is quietly waiting. Jung called the life we are living at this stage the persona, the social mask necessary for survival. It is not bad. It helps us be loved, be accepted, belong. But the problem begins when we mistake that mask for our entire being. When we believe that roles, profession, image, expectations are the essence of who we are. And so, many people live their entire lives without ever realizing that they have never asked the most fundamental question. Jung warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Awakening does not come from living better, more correctly, or more perfectly. It begins with recognizing the unreality in the way we are living. The quiet question does not force you to act. It only asks you to look back. Do you notice that many of the choices in your life, what to study, what to do, whom to love, how to live, were decided very early, before you were even capable of understanding yourself? Family, culture, the fear of being abandoned, the need for recognition. All of it weaves a subtle script, and you, as Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. We call it fate. We call it personality. We call it, "This is just who I am." But perhaps it is only a psychological habit repeated long enough to look like essence. This gentle moment of awakening does not bring excitement. On the contrary, it is often accompanied by a vague, empty, even guilty feeling. Because if we begin to doubt the role we are living, we also begin to doubt the entire value system that has supported our lives for so long. And Jung knew well, no one is ready to give up the feeling of safety all at once. So he did not push. He did not call out, "Be yourself," in a naive way. Jung understood that the ego will resist any threat to its familiar structure. And so, the question must come very softly. Soft enough not to be rejected, deep enough not to be forgotten. Is this life truly yours? Not for you to answer, but to let it stay. Quietly, repeating, like a very small knock on the door of the unconscious. Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And so, the moment you stop rushing to escape, the moment you allow that question to exist without needing to solve it, that alone is already a great step forward. At this stage, there is no right or wrong. There is only honesty. Honest that perhaps you have lived very correctly, but not necessarily very truly. Honest that perhaps you have been successful, but not necessarily whole. Honest that there is a part of you still standing outside the life you are living. And Jung would not call that a failure. He would call it a beginning. For as he once emphasized, life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. Not because of age, but because only when a person dares to look back at themselves does life truly begin. The quiet question does not ask you to change the world. It only invites you to turn inward, where there is a truth very old, very still, and very patient, waiting for you to remember who you are. And when that quiet question has appeared, is this life truly mine? What comes next is not action, but a deeper realization. If this is not entirely my life, then perhaps a script was written long ago, even before I ever knew how to hold the pen. 2. The script you never chose, the life you never wrote. No one wakes up one morning and decides, "Today, I will live a life that is not my own." It does not happen through choice. It happens through adaptation. From a very young age, we learn to read the atmosphere before we learn to read ourselves. We learn what is rewarded and what is rejected. We learn that love is not always unconditional. It often comes with silent expectations. And so, little by little, we adjust ourselves to fit the mold. Carl Gustav Jung called this the process by which the collective unconscious and the social environment quietly write the script of our lives. No force is needed, no violence, only repetition over time. Jung once said, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Yet society still tries to hand all of us the same pair of shoes and teaches us to believe that the pain is normal. Family is where that script begins. Not because they are cruel, but because they, too, are acting out a script handed down from the generation before. The familiar lines, "Stability comes first. Don't be different. You have to be this way to be loved." No one says them outright, but the child feels them, and the unconscious remembers. Jung understood this deeply when he wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. The dreams left unlived, the fears left unexamined in the parents, do not disappear. They are passed on, like faint lines on the draft of a child's life. Then comes society, the media, the culture of success, the repeated images of what a life worth living is supposed to look like. We begin to compare before we ever ask. We run before we understand what we are running from. And slowly, a complete script takes shape. With us as the lead role, but not as the writer. The most dangerous thing about this script is that it is not brutal. It is reasonable. It is disguised as responsibility, morality, even kindness. We do the right things. We become okay people. But somewhere deep inside, a part of us begins to fall silent. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When we do not see the script at work, we call it destiny. We say, I was born this way. Circumstances forced me. Everyone lives like this. But that is not fate. It is a chain of psychological conditions that have never been brought into the light. Fear is the glue that keeps this script standing. The fear of rejection, the fear of disappointing others, the fear of losing safety, the fear of stepping off the familiar path without knowing what awaits. And Jung understood that human beings would rather endure the familiar than face the unknown. He wrote, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. So many people live their entire lives inside a perfect role, while their soul is never truly called by name. The script you never chose does not tell you to tear everything down. It simply invites you to look back. Where did the most important choices in your life truly come from? From authentic desire? Or from the fear of being excluded? From an inner calling? Or from the outer noise repeated so often it began to sound like your own voice? Jung did not encourage blind rebellion. He knew that no one can escape society, but he also insisted that to live without awareness of how one is being shaped is a subtle form of imprisonment. Freedom is not achieved by ignoring the facts of life, but by understanding them. For Jung, freedom begins with awareness, not action. The moment you realize you are reading lines from an old script, you do not need to rewrite it immediately. Just stop, listen, and honestly admit that perhaps many things in your life were decided before you were old enough to object. And that does not make you weaker. It makes you awake. Because only when you see the strings that are pulling you, do you gain the possibility of choosing whether to keep moving in that direction. Jung called this the first step of individuation, becoming yourself, not by creating a new self, but by stepping out of the one that was imposed. The script you never chose does not disappear simply because you see it. But from that moment on, it no longer completely controls you. And sometimes, that alone is enough for a life to begin to turn in a different direction. And when we begin to realize that our lives have been moving according to a script we never wrote, the next thing naturally appears. To live fully inside that script, how carefully a face must we have learned to wear? 3. Persona, the mask that allows us to be loved. No one is born wearing a mask, but very early, human beings learn a silent lesson. To be loved, we must become someone who is acceptable. Carl Gustav Jung called this social face the persona, from the Latin word meaning the actor's mask. It is not false in a shallow sense. On the contrary, the persona is a subtle survival mechanism. Through it, we learn how to adapt, belong, and exist within a community. Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is. The persona helps us survive, but it doesn't help us live truthfully. From a very young age, we watch closely what earns us praise, affection, and acceptance, and what brings indifference, criticism, or coldness. The child does not reason. The child adjusts. If I am obedient, I am loved. If I am strong, I am respected. If I am silent, I am safe." And so, piece by piece, a personality is selected, not because it is authentic, but because it is effective. The persona is formed not by conscious choice, but by emotional reflex. Jung understood that no one can live without a persona. He did not call for its destruction. The problem begins only when a person identifies completely with the mask, when we forget that it is something we wear, and begin to believe that it is who we are. And then, a quiet cost appears. That cost is inner division, because to become acceptable, many parts of us must step back. Feelings that are too intense, desires that come at the wrong time, questions that create discomfort. We do not destroy them. We hide them. And Jung reminds us, whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. What is pushed out of consciousness does not disappear. It only changes form. The more perfect the persona becomes, the thicker the shadow behind it grows. The paradox is this: the more successful a person is with their persona, the more empty they often feel, because they are loved for the role, not for the real person. They are recognized for the image, not for the essence. And somewhere very deep, a special kind of loneliness forms. The loneliness of someone who is always surrounded by people, yet never truly touched. Jung called this a form of self-alienation. He wrote, "The individual who is not aware of his shadow may imagine himself to be quite good, but he is then often compelled to make others responsible for his own faults. When we cling too tightly to a good persona, we are forced to push everything unacceptable outward and begin to feel irritated by, judgmental of, or afraid of the very things we do not allow ourselves to be. The persona does not only hide us from others, it hides us from ourselves. And the most painful truth is this: the mask was first created to be loved, but over time, it makes us stop believing that we deserve love unless we perform well. The quiet question asked whether this life is truly ours. The script you never chose revealed the script we are living. And here, persona uncovers an even more subtle truth. We do not only live by the script, we learn how to become the perfect character within it. Jung did not condemn this. He understood that the persona is necessary, but he also warned, when an individual identifies too closely with his persona, he becomes estranged from himself. This estrangement does not explode into crisis all at once. It accumulates. It appears as nameless fatigue, a sense of falseness, or a vague fear that if others were to see who we really are, they would leave. And so, many people keep wearing the mask, not because they like it, but because they no longer know who they are without it. What Jung invites is not the destruction of the persona, but the recognition of it. The moment you see the mask, you are no longer completely controlled by it. You begin to distinguish what is a role and what is being, what is needed to live in society, and what must be preserved so the soul is not lost. The persona is not the enemy, but it must never be the king. When you dare to admit that you have become acceptable in order to be loved, you also touch a deeper and more painful question. Has anyone ever loved you when you did not need to be acceptable? Jung believed that only when this question is asked does the process of individuation truly begin. Because life does not demand that you tear off every mask at once. It only whispers one very gentle thing. Remember, behind the mask, there is still a human being waiting to be seen. And when the mask has been worn for long enough, something inevitable happens. The parts that do not fit it begin to step back. Not loudly, not in rebellion, but quietly, slipping out of consciousness. Bon. The parts left behind. Nhung man. Bibo lai trong im lang. There is no moment in life when we stand up and declare, "From today, I will abandon a part of who I am." That abandonment does not happen through decision. It happens through prolonged adaptation. When a feeling is labeled too much, when a desire is called unrealistic, when an instinct is marked inappropriate, we do not destroy these parts. We simply learn not to listen to them. Carl Jung called this process a separation from the self, a movement in which the parts that are not accepted gradually fall out of the light of consciousness and slip into the unconscious. Jung wrote, "The conscious mind allows us to make sense of the world, but it is the unconscious that truly governs our behavior. What is no longer acknowledged by consciousness does not disappear. It only loses its voice. And silence is never the same as death." Many people believe they have outgrown parts of who they once were, their sensitivity, their anger, their longing for freedom, their creative hunger, their need to live differently. But Jung would say, if you have not truly faced and integrated these parts, you have only pushed them out of sight. He warned, what you resist persists. What you reject does not leave. It simply waits for another way to return. The parts left behind often come back not as memories, but as symptoms. A sadness with no clear cause, an outburst of anger that feels disproportionate, a hollow feeling in a life that seems stable, or the sense that you are living, but no longer truly feeling anything deeply. Jung did not see this as weakness. He saw it as the call of the forgotten parts. When we are young, denying a part of ourselves is often the price of safety and belonging. But as we grow older, that price begins to reverse. What once helped us survive begins to suffocate us. Jung wrote a sentence that is cold, but honest. Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Psychological distress is rarely random. It is a replacement. When the rightful pain of not being allowed to be oneself is not acknowledged, it finds another form in which to exist. The parts left behind is not about dramatic losses. It is about quiet ones. The loss of the ability to feel joy fully. The loss of primal enthusiasm. The loss of connection to intuition. The loss of an inner voice that was once clear but grew faint because it was not listened to. And the most dangerous part is this. We begin to believe that this is simply who we are. Jung warned against this illusion when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." We call numbness personality. We call emptiness maturity. We call emotional paralysis stability. But deep beneath, the parts that were left behind are still alive, not to sabotage us, but to be recognized. What frightens many people is not the darkness itself, but the possibility that if they turn back toward those forgotten pieces, they will have to feel old pain again. And Jung did not deny this. He did not promise comfort. He insisted, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. To become conscious always hurts, because we don't only remember what was beautiful, but also the wounds tied to being rejected, shamed, or forced to become someone else. And yet, Jung also believed this. The parts that return do not come back to punish us. They come back to complete us. He wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Wholeness does not come from removing what does not fit, but from embracing the opposites within." When a person begins to listen again to the parts that were forgotten, without judgment, without rushing to fix them, something very subtle changes. They do not become more chaotic. They become more real. Emotions deepen. Reactions slow down, but become more precise. And a sense of aliveness returns, not loudly, but undeniably. The parts left behind does not ask you to return to the past to accuse it. It simply invites you to realize this. Many of the things you believe you have lost never actually left. They fell silent because they were not allowed to speak. And Jung would say, the moment you dare to listen to that silence, not to change it immediately, but simply to understand, that is when the process of individuation truly begins. Because you were not born to become perfect. You were born to become whole. And when the parts that were left behind are no longer heard, they do not disappear. They gather in the dark, where another kind of power begins to form. 5. Shadow. The darkness never disappears. Human beings fear the darkness not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is too familiar. Carl Jung called the shadow everything we do not want, do not dare, or are not allowed to acknowledge about ourselves. Not only the traits we label as bad, anger, selfishness, envy, but also the energies that have been suppressed, power, desire, ambition, wildness, freedom, and even the capacity to live fully, the very things we were taught to restrain. Jung wrote a line that is famous, cold and precise. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Everyone has a shadow, and the less conscious we are of it, the darker and more dangerous it becomes. What we run from does not die. It only changes places. When a part of who you are is pushed out of the light, it does not disappear. It learns to live beneath, in the unconscious. And from there, it begins to influence you not through words, but through behavior, reactions, and choices you cannot explain. The shadow does not scream, it whispers. It appears when you overreact to something small, when you hate someone in a way that feels disproportionate, when you sabotage the good things just as they begin to grow in your life, when you keep meeting the same kind of conflict, the same kind of person, the same kind of ending, and call it bad luck. Jung would not call that misfortune. He would call it the shadow steering from behind. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When the shadow is not recognized, it becomes an invisible driver. You believe you are choosing, but very often, you are only reacting. The shadow is not evil, but the shadow that is not conscious is dangerous. Because when we refuse to see the darkness in ourselves, we are forced to see it outside. Jung called this mechanism projection. We assign to others what we cannot accept in ourselves. We call them cruel, fake, greedy, weak, dangerous, when very often, these are the very parts we have buried. Jung wrote, "The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. The shadow takes the shape of everything we do not want to know we are." And here is the deeper irony. The shadow does not only contain what we hate, it also contains the life we never allowed ourselves to live. Many people bury their strength, their decisiveness, their ability to lead, their wild joy, simply because they were afraid of being judged. And so the shadow becomes hungry. And hunger always finds a way back. It returns as disturbing dreams, as toxic relationships that repeat themselves, as self-sabotage at the very moment you are about to be happy. Jung said it plainly. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Light does not solve the shadow. Only awareness does. To face the shadow does not mean to indulge it or excuse harmful behavior. Jung never encouraged that. On the contrary, he believed that the most dangerous person is the one who does not know their shadow, because they believe themselves to be good, and therefore never take responsibility for the darkness acting through them. The person who knows their shadow is different. They are not perfect, but they are honest and responsible. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. When you know you are capable of cruelty, selfishness, weakness, greed, you are less likely to be ruled by them. and you feel less need to condemn them in others. The shadow does not disappear when it is chased away. It softens when it is seen. The moment you dare to admit, what I hate in others has something to do with me. The moment you dare to ask, what is this intense reaction trying to protect inside me? In that moment, the shadow begins to lose its power, not because it is destroyed, but because it no longer has to act in secret. Jung believed that the process of individuation cannot happen without passing through the shadow. He wrote, "There can be no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. There is no wholeness if we try to be only good, only right, only bright, by cutting off half of who we are." The shadow is the gatekeeper of psychological maturity. It does not ask whether you like it. It only asks whether you have the courage to look. Because if you do not step into your own darkness, you will keep living in the light. But that light will not be chosen by you. It will be chosen by fear, long before you ever had the chance to choose for yourself. And when the darkness can no longer whisper inside, it finds another way to exist, by wearing the face of other people. 6. Projection. When you hate others, because of yourself, there are reactions inside us that arrive faster than thought. A look of discomfort, a surge of irritation with no clear reason, a sense of contempt that appears before we understand what is happening. Carl Jung called this projection, not as a moral failure, but as a natural psychological mechanism through which the unconscious shadow seeks expression. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. What disturbs us most in others is often not about them. It is about what they touch in us, in the parts we have not dared to see." Projection is not loud. It is reasonable. It always has a justification. We say, "I hate hypocrisy." But perhaps we have never allowed ourselves to admit the times we had to perform. We say, "I cannot stand weakness." But perhaps we buried our own vulnerability long ago. We say, "I despise greed." But perhaps we never gave ourselves permission to want more. Projection protects the image we have of ourselves. By placing the unwanted parts outside, we preserve the feeling that we are fine, right, good. Jung described it clearly. The projection carries the unconscious content into the object, where it appears as an attribute of that object. We see our own darkness, but we see it somewhere else. This is why projection always comes with certainty. We believe we are judging correctly. We believe our reaction is justified, and we rarely doubt our own feelings, because doubt would force us to turn inward. But Jung emphasized an uncomfortable truth. People do not see the world as it is. They see it as they are. When the shadow is not recognized, the world becomes a distorted mirror. We no longer meet people as they are. We meet the reflections of ourselves. Projection is especially powerful in intimate relationships. We love or hate someone far beyond what their actions alone would warrant. We place on them our expectations, our fears, our desires, and the lives we have not lived. Jung warned, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When projection is at work, something reacts, but not only because of the other person. Two unconscious worlds collide. The danger of projection is this: it robs us of personal power. Because when we believe the problem lies entirely in the other, we have no reason to change ourselves. We fight, argue, accuse, but never touch the root. Jung wrote, "As long as you are unconscious of your own shadow, you will continue to project it onto others." And then, life becomes a series of repeated conflicts, wearing different faces. Projection also explains why we are triggered so strongly by certain types of people. Not everyone provokes us, only those who carry the image of the shadow. They become unwitting keys that open a door we locked long ago, and our reaction, anger, contempt, fear, becomes the signal. Jung did not advise false tolerance. He did not claim that every discomfort is projection, but he offered a sober question. What part of this reaction belongs to me? The moment that question appears, projection begins to lose its force. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When we do not recognize projection, we call conflict destiny. When we recognize it, conflict becomes information about the parts that are asking to be seen. Projection does not carry only darkness. It also carries forgotten light. We may admire someone so deeply that we want to become them because they are living something we have not dared to live. Jung called this positive projection. We place our own potential onto another and then feel small by comparison. But the mechanism is the same. Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, their love is lacking. When we give our inner authority to an external image, we lose connection to our own inner strength. To withdraw projection does not mean to live in constant doubt of every feeling. It means to take responsibility for your reactions. When you stop and ask, "What is this telling me about myself?" you begin to draw the energy back to the center. Jung saw this as a step towards psychological maturity. The withdrawal of projections makes the subject aware of his own defects, and recognizing defects does not weaken us. It makes us real. When projection is withdrawn, the world grows quieter. Other people become less hateful, and you no longer need to fight as much. Not because others have changed, but because you have become clearer. Clear about the parts you carry. Clear about the parts you have not yet lived. Clear that the shadow does not need to be expelled. It needs to be placed where it belongs. Jung believed that only when projection is withdrawn can the process of individuation move forward. Because then, energy no longer flows outward to condemn or to worship. It returns inward to integrate. Wholeness is achieved by the integration of opposites. And that integration begins with a very quiet act, to look at your reaction and recognize yourself within it. When you stop hating others for what they reflect, you do not become indifferent. You become freer. Because then, the world is no longer a battlefield of shadows. It becomes a place where you learn to return to yourself, one withdrawn projection at a time. And when projections are withdrawn, when energy no longer pours outward to hate or to idolize others, a strange space opens. And in that space, the human being begins to come home to themselves. 7. Individuation, not becoming someone else, but returning. In a world obsessed with becoming, Carl Jung said something that runs entirely against the current. The deepest aim of a human life is not to become someone else, but to return to oneself. Jung called this process individuation, not in the modern sense of building a personal brand or creating a more impressive identity. On the contrary, he understood individuation as a journey of retrieval, retrieving the parts that were forgotten, pushed aside, projected onto others, and buried in the unconscious in exchange for adaptation. He wrote, "Individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being, and, insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self." Individuation is not about adding something new. It is about removing what is not you. Many people fear individuation because they confuse it with selfishness or rebellion. But Jung never encouraged the destruction of society or the rejection of responsibility. He understood that human beings need a persona to live. What he warned against was this: do not die inside the mask. Individuation begins when a person no longer runs from the shadow, no longer projects it outward, and no longer tries to fix the world in order to avoid looking inward. And then another question appears, deeper, harder. Which parts of me had to be left behind so that I could become the person I am now? Jung believed that every human being is born carrying a potential form of wholeness, what he called the self. But in order to survive, we are forced to sacrifice parts of that wholeness. Individuation does not erase that past. It moves backward through it to retrieve what was lost. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality. The self is not an ideal ego. It is the whole, light and darkness together. For this reason, individuation is not comfortable. It does not produce a constant feeling of positivity. On the contrary, it is often accompanied by confusion, disorientation, and the sense of losing yourself, when in truth, you are losing what was never truly you. Jung said it plainly. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. To become conscious is always painful, because you do not only reclaim strength, you also reclaim responsibility. When a person stops projecting, stops blaming, stops avoiding, they no longer have many places to hide. They begin to see clearly their own anger, their own weakness, their own hunger for power, their own fear of abandonment. Individuation does not purify these things. It gives them a legitimate place in awareness, and that is what makes a person more grounded. Jung believed that those who have not individuated live mostly in reaction. They are pulled by circumstances, by other people, by unconscious impulses. But when the process of individuation begins, energy returns to the center. A person no longer lives to prove something, and no longer lives to resist. They live from a quiet sense. I am standing in my own place. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This sentence is not about success. It is about inner alignment. Individuation does not make you more special than others. It makes you less false with yourself. And paradoxically, the less you try to be different, the more unique you become. Because no one else carries the same combination of shadow, light, memory, and potential that you do. There is no shared map for this path. Jung emphasized, the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. There is no formula for individuation. Each person must listen to their own symbols, dreams, reactions, and encounters with life. And so, individuation is quiet. It does not need recognition. Often, no one around you notices that you are changing, but you know. Because you no longer have to perform constantly. You no longer have to hate so much. You no longer have to prove so fiercely. You begin to live inside your own life, instead of standing outside it and trying to control it. Jung never said that individuation makes people happy. He said it makes them whole, and wholeness includes pain, limitation, and parts that never become beautiful. But within that wholeness, a deeper kind of peace appears. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. Individuation does not lead you to a new self. It leads you home, back to the person you were before you learned how to fit in, back to the parts that were left behind in silence, back to the truth that you do not need to become someone else in order to begin living. Because, as Jung pointed out, life truly begins when you find yourself. And yet, when the lost parts begin to return, when a person dares to live more truthfully with themselves, a paradox appears. The deepest change does not bring immediate peace. It awakens a powerful inner conflict instead. 8. The inner conflict. the battle between the hero and the shadow. There is a very particular moment in the process of individuation, a moment when a person knows they need to change, yet feels an invisible force pulling them back to the old ground. Not because they are weak, not because they lack understanding, but because inside them, two powers are colliding. Carl Jung understood this moment as an archetypal confrontation. The hero and the shadow. The hero is the part of you that wants to move forward, wants to live truthfully, wants to escape old loops, wants to step out of the persona and live from the self. But the shadow is not an external enemy. It is the part that once helped you survive. It knows the safe zone. It knows the familiar roads. And it whispers, "Here may not be happy, but at least it is safe." Jung wrote, "Where your fear is, there is your task. Where you are most afraid, that is where the inner work is waiting." But human beings rarely walk straight into fear without resistance. And so, the conflict begins. On the outside, we say we want to change. On the inside, we delay. We return to old habits. We recreate familiar relationships. We sabotage new opportunities, and then wonder why we always feel stuck. Jung would not call this meaningless self-destruction. He would call it unconscious loyalty to the old. The shadow does not resist you because it hates you. It resists because it fears losing control. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When this inner conflict is not made conscious, we call it a lack of willpower. But in truth, it is two parts of us fighting for the steering wheel. The hero in us wants to go beyond limits. The shadow in us wants to preserve the familiar order, and what makes this conflict painful is this: both sides have a reason. Jung understood that no one steps into the light without being pulled back by the darkness. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Not by destroying the shadow, but by entering into dialogue with it." Many people misunderstand this. They think change means being strong, decisive, unhesitating. When they stumble, they blame themselves. They call themselves weak. Jung saw something else. He saw in that struggle a crucial sign: individuation is truly happening. Because if nothing in you is changing, there is no conflict. Only when you leave the old orbit does the pull appear. The battle between the hero and the shadow does not happen once. It repeats. Each time you step closer to truth, the shadow asks, "Are you sure?" It reminds you of past pain, old failures, the price you once paid for daring to be different. Jung wrote a deeply unsettling line: "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." When we avoid the rightful pain of change, we receive another kind of pain instead. Longer, vaguer, and repeating. The hero does not defeat the shadow through force. The hero matures through conscious endurance. This is something Jung learned from myth and dreams. The true hero is not the one who feels no fear. The hero is the one who continues while still afraid and does not deny the fear. When the hero tries to become all light, the shadow resists even more violently. That is why Jung did not advise people to overcome their inner conflict. He advised them to stay with it long enough to understand it. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the moral problem and the acid test of one's whole outlook on life. To accept yourself, including the contradiction, is the hardest test of all. The moment you realize that returning to the familiar is not failure, but a signal, the conflict begins to change its shape. You stop fighting yourself. You begin to listen. What in me is afraid? What is trying to protect me? What is longing to live differently? And here, a very subtle transformation occurs. The shadow is no longer a saboteur. It becomes a gatekeeper. It forces the hero to move slowly, to be honest, to pay the real price of change. Jung believed that without the shadow, people would change too fast and break. The greater the tension, the greater the potential. It is the tension between opposites that generates the energy of transformation. So, if you are in a phase where you want to change, yet keep pulling yourself back, Jung would not say you are going the wrong way. He would say, you are standing at the threshold. The old has not yet let go. The new has not yet fully opened. And the soul is learning how to stand between two worlds. This battle has no absolute victor, only integration. When the hero learns to carry the shadow, not letting it drive, but not rejecting it either, a person becomes more grounded, less impulsive, less self-deceptive. And change, then, is no longer a brief rebellion. It becomes a rooted direction. Jung understood that the hardest thing is not stepping out of the familiar, but not returning to it unconsciously. And that only happens when the inner conflict is faced directly, without romanticizing it and without suppressing it. The hero does not kill the shadow. The hero walks with it. And only then does change stop being a sudden impulse and become a deep movement. Slow, true, and irreversible. And as the battle between the hero and the shadow begins to quiet, as a person no longer only fights or submits to themselves, a more subtle layer of conflict starts to emerge. A silent imbalance between the opposing forces within the soul. 9. Anima and animus. The silent inner imbalance. Not every inner fracture is loud. There are cracks that do not stab with pain, but slowly drain the soul dry. Carl Gustav Jung saw one of the deepest causes of this inner dryness in the imbalance between anima and animus. In Jungian psychology, anima is not simply the feminine, and animus is not merely the masculine. They are psychological principles. Anima represents intuition, emotion, the capacity for relationship, softness, receptivity, and inner depth. Animus represents reason, direction, will, structure, boundaries, and the strength to act. Jung wrote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definitive feminine image. And similarly, woman is compensated by a masculine element. Hence, her unconscious has, so to speak, a masculine imprint. Anima and animus are not meant to be eliminated. They are essential to wholeness. But society rarely allows that wholeness. When a child is taught that emotion is weakness, when intuition is dismissed as vague or impractical, when softness is labeled as dangerous, or, on the other side, when strength is called coldness, when decisiveness is judged as selfish, when boundaries are mistaken for lack of care, an essential part of the soul begins to be rejected. And Jung understood this clearly. What is rejected does not disappear. It becomes imbalanced. When anima is suppressed, a person grows rigid, emotionally dry, cut off from their inner life. They may be highly successful, highly correct, yet no longer know what they truly feel. Jung described this state as a kind of desertification of the soul. Where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking. When animus is suppressed, a person becomes submerged in feeling without direction. They sense deeply, but cannot act. They understand, but cannot decide. And they blame themselves for being weak, when what is truly missing is inner structure. The fracture does not arrive all at once. It comes slowly. First, as a nameless fatigue. Then, as the sense of living slightly off-center. Then, as relationships that fail in the same pattern, again and again. And finally, as a deep question. Why do I no longer feel whole, even though everything seems fine? Jung would not look for the answer in circumstances. He would look for it in inner imbalance. Anima and animus were not born to compete. They were born to converse. Jung emphasized, the meeting of the conscious and the unconscious is not a battle, but a dialogue. When one side is silenced, the other becomes extreme. A person too driven by animus without anima lives like a correct machine that no longer vibrates with life. A person too immersed in anima without animus lives in feeling without roots to stand on. And the most dangerous part is this. We often moralize this imbalance. We call coldness strength. We call emotional numbness maturity. Or, on the other side, we call helplessness sensitivity. We call lack of boundaries love. Jung warned clearly. One-sidedness inevitably leads to stagnation. Living on only one side, no matter how much society praises it, leads to psychological dead ends. Anima and animus also often appear through projection. We fall in love or feel deep hatred toward those who carry the image of what we lack. Jung wrote, "The anima is the archetype of life itself. When we lose connection with it, we seek life in others, and then lose ourselves in the relationship. Withdrawing anima and animus is not about changing gender, roles, or surface behavior. It is an inner movement. It is allowing yourself to feel without shame, allowing yourself to be decisive without self-condemnation, allowing intuition and reason to both have a voice." Jung said something essential. The self is made manifest in the opposites and in the conflict between them. The self does not live at one extreme. It appears between the extremes. When anima is restored, a person begins to hear the subtle inner voice again, not to drift with emotion, but to relate more deeply to life. When animus is restored, a person begins to stand more firmly in their decisions, not to dominate, but to take responsibility for their direction. This balance is not loud. It does not make you more impressive. It makes you more grounded. And Jung understood this. Only when anima and animus enter into dialogue does inner conflict stop being a battlefield and become a source of vitality. The greater the tension, the greater the potential. It is the tension held in awareness, not suppressed, not projected, that creates growth. When intuition is no longer treated as weakness, when strength is no longer mistaken for coldness, the soul no longer has to choose sides. It begins to breathe again. Anima and animus do not ask you to become a new ideal. They ask you to stop cutting yourself in half to fit an old one. And Jung would say, when the opposing forces within are allowed to coexist, a person no longer lives in fracture. They begin to move toward wholeness, quietly. And as anima and animus begin to find a shared voice, as the opposing forces within no longer pull you in two directions, a deeper truth starts to reveal itself. There are movements in your life that do not come only from you as an individual, but from ancient patterns that existed long before you were born. 10. Archetypes. The ancient patterns living within you. There are moments when you ask yourself, why do I always fall in love with the same kind of person? Why do I repeat the same mistakes, even after swearing I never will again? Why are there fears that don't come from my personal memories, yet feel strangely familiar? Carl Gustav Jung did not look for the answer in ordinary logic. He found it in archetypes, the primordial patterns of the human mind. Jung defined them as innate structures of the collective unconscious, writing, "The archetype is a tendency to form such representations of a motif, representations that can vary a great deal in detail without losing their basic pattern. In other words, Archetypes are not specific memories. They are the shapes of experience. They are the molds into which our emotions, dreams, conflicts, and choices so often pour. The hero, the betrayer, the mother, the father, the exile, the savior, the seeker. They do not live only in myths or fairy tales. Jung emphasized, the myth is the public dream, and the dream is the private myth. What we dream at night, and what humanity has told itself for thousands of years, speak the same language. So when you find yourself always needing to prove yourself, perhaps the hero archetype is at work. When you constantly sacrifice yourself until you are exhausted, perhaps the mother archetype is operating in the shadows. When you fear success or sabotage what is good in your life, perhaps the exile or the destroyer is speaking. Jung did not see archetypes as a rigid fate, but he warned that when we are unaware of the pattern guiding us, we live as if it were our personality or our destiny. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is why we repeat choices that are not truly our own. Not because we are foolish, not because we are weak, but because we are reenacting an ancient story without knowing which role we are playing. Archetypes become especially powerful when they merge with persona and shadow. A person with an overly kind persona may be possessed by the savior archetype, always fixing, helping, sacrificing, until resentment and burnout appear. A person who identifies with strength may be controlled by the warrior archetype, always fighting, never resting, never allowing vulnerability. Jung wrote, "When an archetype takes possession of us, we are no longer ourselves. When the pattern takes over, inner freedom is lost, even if, on the outside, we seem highly in control." The danger is not in the archetype itself. The danger is in unconsciousness. Archetypes are neither good nor evil. They are primordial energies. When they are recognized and integrated, they become strength. When they are denied, they become repeating fate. Jung believed that many psychological crises do not come from present circumstances, but from an archetype that has awakened without being recognized. Midlife, for example, is often when the seeker archetype emerges, questioning meaning, direction, and soul. If it is suppressed, it turns into depression. If it is listened to, it opens a deeper life. The individuation process is closely related to the emergence of archetypal images. Individuation does not separate us from humanity. It makes us conscious of how humanity is living through us. When you recognize a pattern at work, you no longer have to fight it. You begin to dialogue with it. The hero no longer has to battle all the time. The mother learns to set boundaries. The exile discovers that their loneliness carries wisdom. Archetypes begin to serve you instead of ruling you. Jung emphasized that modern people do not lack knowledge. They lack symbols. When we do not understand the images living in the unconscious, they control us from behind the scenes. But when we learn to read them, through dreams, reactions, relationships, and the stories we are drawn to, we begin to live more consciously. Not by breaking the pattern, but by finding our rightful place within it. We are not just individuals, we are also representatives of humanity. You do not live only for yourself, but you can live with awareness of what is living through you. And here is the deepest part. When you realize that your fears, dreams, and conflicts are not only personal, you stop blaming yourself so harshly. You see that you are walking a path many have walked before, with familiar mistakes, but also with a potential for transformation proven over time. Archetypes do not imprison you. They offer you a map. When you know which story you are repeating, you gain the chance to continue it differently. Not to reject the past, but to bring consciousness into an ancient current. And Jung would say, when a person recognizes the patterns living within them, they do not lose their freedom. They touch it for the first time. The freedom to live as a conscious individual within the long history of the human mind. And as you begin to see the ancient patterns moving through you, a deeper question naturally arises. If you have been shaped all this time by archetypes, then who is the I you have been holding on to so tightly? Really? 11. The illusion of identity. The illusion of a fixed self. Human beings carry a powerful need to know who they are. We need a name for ourselves, a story to tell, a stable image to hold on to. And very early in life, the ego steps onto the stage to perform this task, to create a sense of continuity that says, "This is me." Carl Gustav Jung called this structure the ego, not an enemy, not a mistake. The ego is the center of consciousness, the anchor that helps us orient ourselves in the world. But Jung also warned, when a person identifies completely with the ego, they build for themselves a subtle prison, decorated with certainty. Jung wrote, "The ego is only the center of consciousness, not the center of the whole personality. The ego is not the whole of who we are, but it often claims that role. The illusion of a fixed self forms when we believe we have an unchanging essence. I am this kind of person. I would never be that kind of person. That is not who I am." These statements sound like self-knowledge, but in truth, they freeze a living human being into a narrow point of experience. Jung did not see clarity in this. He saw a fear of change. If I am a strong person, I do not have to face my vulnerability. If I am a good person, I do not have to look at my anger. If I am a rational person, I do not have to listen to my intuition. The ego builds a wall, not to attack the world, but to protect the image of itself. Jung said it plainly. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And one of the most subtle ways to avoid the soul is to cling tightly to a self that appears solid and defined. But life does not stand still. The unconscious does not stand still. The parts left behind, the archetypes at work, the opposing inner forces, all of them continue to move. And when the ego tries to hold a fixed image, tension begins to build. Crisis does not come because we change. Crisis comes because we do not allow ourselves to change. Jung observed that much psychological suffering comes from rigid identification with an identity. He wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. We do not solve ourselves. We outgrow our old images if we allow it. The illusion of a fixed self makes us believe there is a correct version of who we are that must be defended at all costs, so we resist experiences that threaten that image. Failure, contradiction, changing values, or a new call from within. We call them mistakes. Jung called them signals. What we don't confront in ourselves, we will meet as fate. When we refuse to face our inner movement, life will force us to face it, through events. The ego wants certainty. The self, the whole, does not. For Jung, the self is not an identity, but a living totality that includes both conscious and unconscious. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. When the ego believes it is the center, it cuts itself off from most of who we are. And then a person lives very consistently, but no longer vividly. The illusion of identity also traps us in the past. We defend old choices because they confirm our self-image. We are afraid to admit, I may have changed. Jung did not see this as betrayal of the self. He saw it as a sign of growth. Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. Not because of age, but because at some point, the old self-image is no longer wide enough to hold the person we are becoming. Letting go of the illusion of a fixed self does not mean losing direction. It creates a deeper humility. I am not an image, I am a process. And that process has the right to change, to contradict itself, and to expand. Jung emphasized that individuation is not about strengthening the ego, but about placing the ego in its rightful position as a coordinator, not a dictator. When the ego loosens its grip, a person does not fall apart. They exhale. They no longer have to defend the old story. They begin to listen to the story that wants to be told now. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the moral problem and the acid test of one's whole outlook on life. For Jung, self-acceptance is not clinging to a pleasant image. It is accepting the movement of inner life. And here is the paradox. When the ego stops fixing itself, a person becomes more grounded. Not because they know exactly who they are, but because they no longer need to know for certain. The illusion of a fixed self promises safety, but it takes away the capacity to grow. When the wall of the ego loosens, what was kept outside, shadow, intuition, conflict, potential, begins to return. Not to break you, but to widen you. And Jung would say this: you were not born to become a fixed someone. You were born to live fully the process of becoming. When you stop asking, "Who am I?" as a question that must be carved in stone, and begin asking it as a living question, the ego stops being a wall. It becomes a door, and as the illusion of a fixed self begins to soften, as the wall of the ego steps down from the center, a very different presence appears. Not something you have to create, but something that has been there all along. 12. The self. You were never lost. You only forgot you were here. There is a quiet truth that Carl Gustav Jung devoted much of his life to pointing toward. Human beings do not lose themselves. They only forget where they are standing. We search for ourselves everywhere, in achievement, in roles, in love, in the stories we tell about who we are. But Jung said the opposite. The self we are looking for has never gone anywhere. He called this presence the self. The self is not a new identity to put on. It is not the best version of you. It is the living totality that includes both conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, what has been lived and what is still waiting to be lived. Jung wrote, "The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality." If the ego is the center of consciousness, the self is the center of the whole. And so the Jungian journey does not end with fixing a person. It ends with remembering. Remembering that behind the persona, behind the shadow, behind the ancient patterns and the inner conflicts, there is a deeper order holding everything together. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Jung said, but he also understood that this pain is not meant to destroy. It is meant to open the way toward wholeness. The self does not arrive as a loud voice. It does not argue. It does not force. It appears as a sense of being in the right place. Many people describe the moment of touching the self not as overwhelming joy, but as a strange, quiet peace. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because the inner world is no longer torn in two. Jung expressed this with a simple image. The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Not a humiliating defeat, but a defeat of the need to control. When the ego steps down from the throne, the person does not collapse. They are supported. The self does not erase contradiction. It contains contradiction. It allows anima and animus to speak to each other. It allows the hero to walk with the shadow. It allows the parts left behind to return without having to become beautiful. Jung emphasized, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Wholeness is not purity. Wholeness is having enough space. And so, when a person touches the self, they no longer need to prove who they are. They no longer need to hate so much, to love so desperately, or to run from what feels uncomfortable. They begin to live from an inner axis. Jung called this the centering of psychological life, where action is no longer an unconscious reaction, but a conscious response. Freedom is not achieved by ignoring the facts of life, but by understanding them. Freedom here is not freedom from suffering. It is freedom within suffering, without being ruled by it. The self does not promise permanent happiness. Jung was careful with such promises. He knew that life moves through opposites, but when the self becomes the axis, those opposites no longer tear the person apart. The greater the tension, the greater the potential. Tension, when held in awareness, becomes living energy. And this is essential. The self is not a goal to be reached. It is not at the end of the road. It is the ground that has always been there, hidden beneath layers of adaptation. This is why Jung said individuation is not about becoming the self, but about allowing the self to be present in everyday life, in small choices, in timely boundaries, in honesty with feeling, and in the courage to pause. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This is not about reaching a peak. It is about a deep alignment between outer life and inner order. When the self is remembered, a person becomes less afraid of being lost, because they understand that being lost is only a temporary loss of connection. And connection can be restored, not through force, but through patient attention. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The light of the self is not blinding. It is just bright enough to see the way. And so the Jungian journey ends quietly. No triumph, no promise of a transformed life, only a truth returned to its rightful place. You were never lost. You only forgot that there is a deeper center holding you, even when you are tired, even when you make mistakes, even when you are confused. The self does not ask you to be better than yesterday. It only invites you to be more here today. Here with what is present. Here with both light and shadow. Here in a life that is not perfect, but connected. And Jung would say this: when you stop searching for yourself out in front and begin remembering that you are already here, life does not need to begin again. It is already continuing, quietly, in its own rhythm and whole.